No, a thing you point out, you have in previous conversation that I listened to, as well as in the book, this notion that hunters in many ways kind of occupy the border, or the fringe between civilized society and the wilderness. And that's bedded deep even within American history, but it goes all the way deep into the biblical history as well. Nimrod, somebody who's identified with these building of empire cities, but yet also a hunter. A hunter, again, is not one who hangs around doing animal husbandry, but who's out in the wild, in the wilderness. So just for our biblical theological folks, just think about that. God placed man in the garden, and he told man to cultivate, but yet the hunter would be somebody who would be kind of on the edge of that, out hunting in the wild. So that hunting figure always is on that edge.
Always on the edge.
And then we start to see the perception of that hunter, as you're pointing out, is largely driven by kind of how people view both sides of those things there. And then you have the added element of Nimrod being from the line of Ham from Cush, which
Right.
he's on the other side, an accursed side of covenant history. So he's a very complex figure. Trying to
Exactly.
understand how to interpret him, we can see how there have been different positions on it throughout the years.
Right. So, I mean, again, the term I use a lot, I mean, my next book, maybe I'll just name it On the Edge, but is that hunters are always liminal characters. So, if we look at the interpretation of him, let's say in Christian tradition, perhaps one of the most important one is that of Augustine.
Yeah,
And Augustine goes and sees in particular, remember when Augustine lives, he's
sure.
born somewhere
Fourth
around
century.
355, something
Mm-hmm.
like that, and he dies in 430. So he's living just at the end of empire, just as the Roman Empire is crumbling. And we've
Hence his
got,
book, on the two kingdoms. Mm-hmm.
right, right. So we've got the city of God, and we've got this question of how do we separate the temporal, the political, which is failing, from the spiritual, which has long been connected now to Rome, etc. When we can't have God's kingdom crumbling, God's kingdom has to continue. Where do we find it in regards to the political world? So we have these separation of spheres. So Augustine, when he looks at Nimrod, paints him in a very negative fashion. He sees him as a builder of empires, a hunter of men, and he's building a little bit on some Jewish tradition that's there. Essentially, he becomes what we might call a tyrant.
Mm.
And so Augustine, of course, has an influence that almost is, it's exceptional in Christian tradition, and one would argue even in the Reformed tradition. And so Augustine's commentary then goes for generations. Its effects go for generations. By the time we get to the early modern period, and of course the Protestant traditions that are emerging in Europe then during the 16th century, we have new interpretations, but not surprisingly, many of the early reformers turn to Augustine's commentaries for guidance on these fuzzy issues. And we see then this question of is hunting a viable option?
Mm-hmm.
And many of them perpetuate a relatively negative evaluation of Nimrod as we see nation states begin to expand during this early modern period. So rather than empire building, he's a nation builder.
Mm.
And we move then into the Enlightenment period. Nimrod then he's not so much a nation builder; he's a guy who tramples human rights. These things that we're beginning to talk about in the late 1600s, early 1700s.